Today we want to take a look at Exodus chapter 16, verses 13, 14, and 15. And we'll title this little piece, What is it? You'll see what I mean. Look at it here. Exodus chapter 16, starting at verse 13. We read this. In the morning, the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there, on the surface of the wilderness, was a small round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is it? For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Now, the people of Israel came to call this substance manna. That's in verse 31 of Exodus chapter 16. But at first, they just wondered what it was. A huge nation traveled through a vast wilderness, and they needed food. They couldn't just buy it. They had to trust God to provide it, and He sent it every morning from heaven. The bread from heaven came each day as something that was left behind from the morning dew. It was small, round, and as fine as frost on the ground. Thus, it was not easy to gather. It had to be swept up from the ground. Exodus chapter 16, verse 31 further describes the bread from heaven as being like coriander seed. That means it was about the size of a sesame seed, and it was sweet like honey. Numbers chapter 11, verse 7 says that it was the color of bdellium. That's like a pearl-like color. And they prepared manna by either baking or boiling. That's in Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. Now, what was this bread from heaven? Many people seek to identify it with what some Arabic people today call man, which is formed when, quote, a tiny insect punctures the bark of the tamarisk tree, drinks the sap, and exudes a clear liquid that solidifies as a sugary globule when it hits the ground. When the sun comes up, it melts quickly and disappears. That's by an author named Jamie Buckingham. Though the bread from heaven may have been similar to the modern-day man that you can find in the Sinai Peninsula today, it wasn't the same thing. The modern-day man never appears in great quantities, and this did. It doesn't last year-round, and this did, and it's confined to a very small geographic region, and this traveled with Israel throughout their wilderness wanderings. Perhaps a better question than what is this, is to ask why. Why did God feed them with manna? His purpose in sending the bread from heaven was not only to provide for the material needs of Israel, but also to teach them eternal lessons of dependence on God. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3 says this, So He humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you to know that man shall not live by bread alone, but that man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Again, that's Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. When God puts us in a place of need, He wants to do more than just provide for the need. He wants to teach us eternal lessons. Sometimes God has to teach us this way because we're too thick-headed to learn any other way. I like what Charles Spurgeon said. He said this, quote, Animals are often taught through their food. When they could not be reached in any other way, they have been instructed by their hunger and by their thirst and by their feeding. Now, the sending of manna also taught Israel how to work with God. They couldn't just lay back and have God pour it into their mouths. Feeding Israel through the bread from heaven was an example of God's way of cooperating with man. Israel could not bring the manna, and God would not gather it for them. Each had to do their part. And when the manna came, Israel didn't know what it was. The name manna, that's given later in Exodus chapter 16, verse 31, means literally, what's that? And it comes from the question that was asked in verse 15. When God provides, we often don't recognize it. Now, here's the great news. In the Gospel of John, Jesus told us that He is the bread from heaven. Isn't it strange that some people look at Jesus today and say, "What's that? What is this?" But Jesus is God's ultimate provision. God has promised to meet all our needs, not necessarily all our expectations, but all of our needs. And He fundamentally meets these for us in Jesus Christ. Will you let God provide bread from heaven for you today?